Good morning. My name is Ellie Gold. I'm the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy here in Washington, D.C. We're a think tank that focuses on national security and defense-related matters, as well as foreign policy. Today, we're going to have a conversation regarding the role of law enforcement in combating anti-Semitism. As we've seen over the past number of years, but in particular over the past number of months, we have seen the rise of anti-Semitism globally, reaching levels that we have not seen in decades, maybe centuries. And today, especially in the United States, here in whether it's in New York or any of our major cities, we have seen the rise of anti-Semitism to likes that I have never seen before. Today, I'm pleased to have joining us Marc Black. Marc is actually our most recent senior fellow, joining the Gold Institute for International Strategy as a senior law enforcement fellow. Recently retired from NYPD, New York Police Department. Marc has a very unique experience in dealing with anti-Semitism. Marc spent 20 years at NYPD, and he retired as the rank of a detective investigator. During his time, he focused on counterterrorism in the Counterterrorism Division with the arson and explosion squad, the computer crimes squad, and the intelligence division. Aside from his university training here, Marc spent a lot of time in Israel and received degrees in the Israeli universities as well. So welcome, Marc. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Actually, I attended the University of Haifa, but came back to the States to finish my education.
Okay. Well, I stand corrected. I stand corrected. But I have no doubt that you have taken the best from Israel and brought it here with you. So, but before we begin our conversation today, and this will be a conversation. You know, the fantastic thing about my time that I spend with Marc is I call Marc for a question on a specific item, and 2 hours later we're still discussing this and getting delving deep. Now, we're going to keep this conversation to as close to an hour as possible, but I think that as with it's sometimes difficult for Marc to keep it to an hour as well. So these conversations are very interesting, and let's see where it goes. So before we begin, though, Marc, if you would you please just give us a little bit a sense of your background and your time at NYPD, and why I feel that you're most qualified to talk about these issues.
Well, I started my career back in 2000, and I hit the streets in the Lower East Side. Anybody who knows the Lower East Side of Manhattan knows that that's Orchard Street around there. And at the time, if you look way back in history, that's what where a lot of the Jewish community coming from Europe had settled down in. By the time I got there, it was under regentrification. And I always made inroads with the Jewish community there. And something really funny that did happen on Henry Street, I can never forget this, was that I saw a lot of people running into what we call the walk-ups. And I told my partner, hey, hold the radio. Let me go inside and see what's happening. And on the first landing of the walk-up, I go in, and what do we have? A little shul. And, of course, the rabbi introduces himself. And all along Henry Street in the whole area, there were these little shuls. So I started to become immersed in the Jewish community from a law enforcement perspective. But then as I went through the ranks with NYPD, ending up in, for instance, the arson explosion squad. We work closely with the hate crimes unit, the hate crime squad, which very talented professionals. And we would give them assist anytime there was a post-blast incident and or an arson, particularly dealing with a house of worship. And there were a lot of times when we also had to go in and check the synagogues. There was a fire. Is this criminal or is this not? And I made a lot of headway into the community that way. And since our unit was citywide, I met a diversity of the Jewish community from all different cultures. And then when I ended up in Counterterrorism Division, one of the things that I did was I was involved in conducting a lot of security and vulnerability assessments. And by doing that, I did come in a lot of contact with Jewish synagogues, Jewish institutions on how to improve and or start a physical security protocol that would detect, deter, deny an adversary from committing a serious physical injury and or death. And basically what we were trying to do with physical security at a lot of these synagogues was create time and distance, enough time so the good people can distance themselves from the threat. And, you know, you come in contact with a lot of people from various backgrounds in the Jewish community that have a diverse opinions, a diverse understanding of security, politics, what's happening with Israel, what's happening throughout the world with the United States. And recently, although I am retired, I still keep in touch with a lot of the institutions that I assisted. And not just here in New York, but also if anybody did request in the United States within the Jewish community. And it's a very interesting time, Ellie. It's a very interesting time because of what has happened with the defund the police movement and how this will have or is having a direct impact on the safety and security within the Jewish community.
So thank you. Now, we're about to get started in the substance of this conversation, but I do want to let people know, while we may quote polls and other details or other sources, the purpose of this conversation is really to get a firsthand understanding from somebody who recently retired from NYPD, and this is going to be a practical discussion, something that law enforcement as a whole, or I will say as an individual from Marc's perspective, but I suspect that it's not a singular thought, and that is just practically what the role of law enforcement in combating anti-Semitism, the impact of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism, and so on. So, you know, let's begin. I mean, based on so Marc, from your perspective, do we see a higher rate of anti-Semitic crimes than other hate crimes? Generally.
You know, that's a very interesting question, and what I'm really interested to see is, in general, I would say that the Jewish community probably seeing an uptick right now. Historically, there always has been anti-Semitism in the United States. The question becomes: is there more now, presently, than there was in the past within the United States or in the past in North America? And are we seeing that? And the question is why? Why? Why are we seeing more of it? And it's going to be interesting to see when statistics come out with the FBI and NYPD. We'll probably have to wait till early next year or when they formulate all the data to see what the uptick is going to be from when I left the job or 2 years before I left the job till now. I would say that anti-Semitism in the United States has always been there. But what we have today is a 24-hour news cycle, and we also have social media. And I think it's more overt today where in the past, someone wanted to commit an anti-Semitic attack, let's say on a synagogue, it was done at night. No one wanted to be caught. But today, because of I want to show the world what I can do through social media, it's become more overt. Now, statistically speaking, we'll have to see when all this data is going to be correlated and broken down through our federal law enforcement agencies and also the New York City Police Department, which will be very interesting in the future. I do know that the undercurrent, speaking to a lot of people within the Jewish community, even where I live, is that the feeling is that there is an uptick. They see it on the news. And they also see that what has happened with the attacks on the streets now being more overt, where we had the Palestinian demonstrations on the West Coast and now in New York City, that is something that right now we haven't seen in a while. We heard about it on the college campuses, but now that has within mainstream. I think there's going to be more of this, and the reasons are, I think that we might see more of this is because of the riots that had happened with the anarchist, defund the police through BLM, when they went to protest in the beginning. When I first left in mid 2020, police departments' hands were tied. What has happened because of that, the attacks now that happened with the Palestinian and also others, not just the Palestinian, but other attacks that have happened within the Jewish community, they are copycatting those protests. And that's very interesting to see. And that's where now with social media, we see this all bubbling up.
Is this unprecedented?
Listen, we all have grandparents who lived around New York City back in the 30s with the German Bund.
Right.
Yaphank, New York. Is it unprecedented? Absolutely not. Not unprecedented. What is unique is the way that the messaging is being done today, with some very sophisticated messaging through the social media. Okay. That's what's unique about this situation. And once again, being so overt, not worrying about being caught.
Got it. It's so interesting. Let's take a hard look at this, and let's talk about police reforms. I know in New York, there have been police reforms across the country. There have been as well. Before we get, let's step away from anti-Semitism for a second, and let's talk specifically about police reforms and how does that impact your doing your job. I saw that there was just recently I saw an article just this morning about a 10-year-old kid who was in Brooklyn, I think it was, that was killed, and the left-wing media is saying says, and this is that left-wing article that I read this morning would say that the police are so busy dealing with a curfew that they couldn't reach this 10-year-old kid, which is, I mean, it's tragic. There's no question about it. The question becomes: is it that the police are misguided in dealing with a curfew at 10 o'clock in one part of New York, and therefore, or is it something else?
Well, let's talk about the police reform. We just recently also heard about Asheville Police Department in Asheville, North Carolina now, with such a manpower shortage that they're telling people to make their complaints online. I mean, let's face what's happened. Here's the situation that with this police reform, it's not reforming anything. What's happening now is the good people, the good citizens on the street, are now becoming victims. And what's going to happen is you're going to have, and especially with something that we'll probably discuss a little later on, is if you look at states such as New Mexico, Colorado's, and others, and New York City taking away qualified immunity from civil servants, particularly police, law enforcement professionals. What does that mean in general? Well, You will no longer have proactive policing. You have inactive policing. The other thing that's going to happen is there's the manpower shortage. A lot of departments throughout the United States, because of this defund the police movement, are having manpower shortages. And they have to look to where they're going to reallocate those resources now to combat crime through their crime statistics. This has a direct effect on what we're discussing today with the Jewish community, particularly here in New York City, and probably in other cities or in other municipalities across the United States. So the question then becomes is, where does that police supervisor allocate the resources to best combat crime in their area? And what happened with the defund the police movement, in a way, when you look at it, they wanted to reduce police budgets. But what really happened is they reduced police ranks, because a lot of men and women who are in law enforcement across all ranks have just had a low sense of morale. With the qualified immunity, that also increased separation from their departments as well. So with low morale combined with also this drastic attrition rate of police leaving, that has a great influence on the crime that's being committed in our cities today. And we see that particularly in New York City right now.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm really curious. Let's go back and talk. Let's move back and talk about crime, anti-Semitism. We've seen the rise of vandalism to synagogues is increasing exponentially. Is that any worse than any other house of worship?
Oh yeah, well, from my time on the job, what I'm seeing right now is yes, because we just had an incident in the Bronx about a week ago where they finally captured the perpetrator who vandalized, broke windows, graffiti, what have you, synagogues up in the Bronx. And because of bail reform, they caught the IP, but because of bail reform, he's back out on the streets. Well, what sort of message does that send to the bad guys? Well, look, you can vandalize a synagogue and actually have no repercussions. So this is the thing. If there are no repercussions through our judicial system, the courts, right, okay, because the judge's hands are tied or the prosecutor's hands are tied, then what are the police to do? If the police go out and arrest an individual for a crime on probable cause, and they have the evidence and present it to the courts through the prosecutor's office, but the court's hands are tied from keeping that individual off the streets, what does that say? That is the wrong message. And this is directly affecting the Jewish community now. This should be a warning for anybody, any group of people, but particularly now with anti-Semitism, is if you're allowing the lawmakers to put this sort of policies through, there are going to be repercussions. There are going to be some serious repercussions. And we're starting to see that right now. So I mean, right now I'm spending all this time asking you questions, but we're going to have, we're going to transition to a conversation here at some point. But the topic of today's conversation is really the role of law enforcement in combating anti-Semitism. Can you give me or give us a sense as to what is the role of law enforcement in combating anti-Semitism? And I'm just going to qualify the question because in a big way, everybody looks to law enforcement and says, if there is, and by the way, you just touched on this briefly in your talk about the vandalism upstate New York, but if in fact we are, so everybody looks to law enforcement and says, well, NYPD, Marc Black is clearly not doing his job because there was vandalism to a synagogue.
what is the role of law enforcement in combating anti-Semitism? And from your perspective, what needs to be done elsewhere?
Well, first off, at least when I was on the job, if we had a case and we're working, when I was arson explosion squad, and or if I was even with computer crimes or whoever it might be, if I'm working hand in hand with the hate crimes unit, and there was an attack on the Jewish community, by far it's to protect and preserve, and being unbiased, going after that criminal. That's the first thing, is to go. The question then becomes, how in this climate, in this politically charged climate, can law enforcement efficiently and effectively combat anti-Semitism? Do they have all the tools? When I mean by tools, I'm not just talking about technology and what have you. Do they have the right policies in place where the average investigator will not have to worry about, for instance, doing their job and worrying about, oh, there's no more qualified immunity for my protections? You want somebody out there who's, and supervisors as well, who don't have to look over their shoulder and say, ooh, is something going to come back and bite me? What you want is very driven, motivated, high morale, effective and efficient law enforcement professionals to protect, in this case, the Jewish community. Okay. And to be, most importantly here's something very interesting that's happening, is to be proactive. That's very important, because what we're seeing now, one of the reasons we're seeing this uptick, and it's all over the news and media, is that we see that policing now has become inactive. So going forward, there has to be positive policy to allow law enforcement to do their job, and to at least know, for the average investigator or patrol person, to at least know that the municipality has their back. Because if you don't have confidence in your community to do the patrol correctly, or to do the investigation, or even to do the right thing, because you're always going to be concerned about what's happening, you know, then there's going to be a problem. But I think that good investigators on the street are trying to do everything they can to combat this. The question is how aggressively it's being done. Now, I'm not in the trenches anymore. I've retired. So I only hear from my former colleagues who are still working. And really, it's become, the way I like to put it, inactive policing, because everybody's concerned about this issue. Everybody is concerned about the issue, about what's happening with the defund the police movement.
You know, 100%. I mean, as a civilian, we're concerned about this defund the police movement, and the impact that has on crime across the board. But I'm pleased to see that there have been a lot of grants by Department of Homeland Security and elsewhere to synagogues who are to beef up their security. I have no doubt that that is working splendidly, and everybody is beefing up security at the synagogue level or at the house of worship level, as they should be. I know that you've had conversations with houses of worship, so I know that you can certainly, and I'm sure during our conversation you'll tell, you'll indicate how that's going, and if you positive or negative and so on. But I suspect that those things are good. But I mean, I guess when I look at anti-Semitism, listen, as an Orthodox Jew myself, one who frequents the synagogue, there's no doubt about it that there's great concern. But my question really, I mean, to me, I really wonder, is the impact on the synagogue any worse than the impact on the church? Is it any worse in the Orthodox community versus the conservative or Reform communities, and so on? We've seen uptick of crime against the houses of worship. We saw in South Carolina and elsewhere. You know, how does one who is not paying attention to this, how do we really reconcile or figure out, you know, how much is anti-Semitism and how much is not? Now, again, for those who are tuning in now at this point, I just want to be clear that this is a practical conversation. This isn't an academic discussion. This isn't anyone suggesting that there's no anti-Semitism. This is just a practical conversation from somebody in law enforcement.
So you bring up a very good point. And when I go out to the Jewish community, I say even before what's happening today, when I was on the job, and even privately, I say, look, the Jewish community is a target. That's number one. The adversary, the anti-Semitic adversary, sees you as a target. They don't care about your denomination, whether you're Orthodox, conservative, or Reform. They don't care about your politics. They don't care. They just see you as a target because you are Jewish. It's that simple. Now, what we're seeing now, and even we've always seen vandalism on synagogues, even when I was on the job, as we called it. But what we see the uptick in is actually the physical confrontations. And that's because of what we saw when police weren't allowed to do their jobs, as I stated before, when the protests first broke out with Antifa and BLM. What we see now is that these copycat protest crimes that physically now are starting to affect the Jewish community. That is something I did not see much of. We saw the actual crime against the property, but not too much. I'm not saying there wasn't, but not too much the physical, the kinetic contact one-on-one with an individual. And I think for the Jewish community here in the United States, what they have to realize is, let me even backtrack on this. Those who are in law enforcement who have to deal with the Jewish community have to understand that the Jewish community is extremely diverse. And what I mean by that is I'm not talking about the religion of Judaism. I'm talking about, and I mentioned this to police officers, there's a cultural and ethnic background as well. I mean, you have not only Jewish people from Europe, from North America, from Africa, from North Africa, South Asia. So the way that they view security and the way that they view the role of law enforcement in protecting them is much, much different. For instance, this is completely my observation, what I'm about to talk about, and completely from experience. The Orthodox community within the United States, I always found, could never get enough security. It could never get enough. And these tend to be communities that tend to be a little more insular. And they were always trying to get as much of security as they can. The conservative movement, even though that's kind of like not as big when I was growing up, but they're like, okay, security. The Reform movement, except for some very large Reform synagogues that I dealt with, tend to steer away from security in a very aggressive way. The least they see, the better. They want it, and then they don't want it. Except for the few large synagogues that I dealt with in the Reform movement, and then the question comes: well, what's their contact or liaisoning with law enforcement? And this is very, very important for the Jewish community to understand, and also for law enforcement to understand, particularly those law enforcement departments and municipalities that now that we see that there's a mass movement of people leaving the Northeast and from California and setting up in other parts of the United States. Maybe there was one synagogue, but now maybe there might be 2, 3. We see these synagogues popping up. Liaisoning is very, very important in combating anti-Semitism because, one, you have to understand, and I did this all the time. I floated in between all the denominations of Judaism, all the different cultures within Judaism. I knew I would have to speak differently or use a different approach to security and to policing when dealing with these different cultures and ethnicities within Judaism and different religious denominations. These are things that law enforcement, outside major cities where this new influx are moving to are going to have to learn. They're going to have to learn this, because when there are anti-Semitic attacks, it's already too late. You need to know what you need to know already, how to protect, detect, deter, deny. You have to know the adversary. You have to know the adversary, and you most definitely need to know the penal laws within your state or in your local municipalities to combat anti-Semitism. And all this information, the physical footprint of the synagogue, what law enforcement can and can't do, that's very important. What's the expectations of law enforcement? What is the expectation of the synagogue or Jewish organization for security? And to have those meetings of the mind to come up with some sort of policy, program, or procedure to work together.
You know, so let's take a break for a minute. When we come back, let's talk about the program that you are working on at the Institute with regards to proactive work on anti-Semitism and proactive combating anti-Semitism. But let's take a break, and we'll come right back.
I'm Martin Johnson with the Gold Institute for International Strategy. I've been in law enforcement for 36 years, 25 years of doing it, and 11 years of teaching it. I look for details and solutions. I always did. The Gold Institute does the same thing, paying particular attention to national security issues. Perspectives from domestic and international sources are always considered. They're always intertwined, no matter what the topic. The Institute uses research and active study as tools to define issues, look for solutions, find the pathways, establish goals, and get the ball rolling. You can write all the papers in the world and do all the research in the world, but if you don't get the ball rolling, how much good have you done? The Institute has solid leadership, has an awful lot of very smart people whom I've had the privilege to meet. I've learned a lot. You can learn a lot too. There's an awful lot of good work being done. Please feel free to check out the website, look at the mission statement, follow them up. It's worth it. It really is. I'm very happy to be part of it, and I look forward to continuing my relationship with the Gold Institute for International Strategy.
Welcome back. I'm Eli Gold, president of the Gold Institute, and with me today is Marc Black, our senior fellow at the Gold Institute. So today we're talking about the role law enforcement plays in combating anti-Semitism, and Marc Black, who recently retired from NYPD and has joined the Gold Institute as a senior fellow, is here talking about, practically speaking, the roles and how law enforcement deals with anti-Semitism. Now that we're back, I want to talk to Marc, because Marc is really working on a project right now for the Institute to provide proactive solutions for law enforcement and others in combating anti-Semitism or combating attacks on houses of worship. It doesn't only happen to synagogues. It happens to churches as well. Today we happen to be talking about anti-Semitism. So, Marc, if you can, when we began discussing this idea of this project, the Gold Institute, we really look for practical solutions and to provide the practical blueprint with which to implement policy changes. So the question I have, when we began discussing this, the question I had was how can we proactively prevent attacks rather than just having law enforcement come afterwards and clean up the scene? Can you tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on and what you hope that we'll be able to accomplish.
Right. So, as you know, Ellie, when I first came on, the Institute was looking at what is anti-Semitism here in the United States? How does it look? And how can we practically protect the Jewish community? And also, what does law enforcement need to look at when protecting the Jewish community? And essentially, that was basically my career with counterterrorism, with working with the houses of worship. So what do we have to look at? When we look at this, now I'm talking now looking at it from someone from law enforcement. Okay. So what does that average law enforcement professional need to know, and what should they know? Well, when we spread across the United States, the real goal is that if you look at the average patrol officer, let's say in the 7-1 precinct on Eastern Parkway, if you look at the average patrol person or investigator in the 9-0 precinct, has a very large Jewish community who might not be Jewish. They understand certain things, right, because that's their beat. That's what they do day in. They come into this contact with the community. So the first thing that's to be achieved is to really educate or make aware of those law enforcement communities that are starting to see a large population growth within their communities of the Jewish community, and speak to them and let them know that, one, the Jewish community does not speak with one voice when it comes to security and comes to law enforcement policy. That they have to know. The other thing is, from a cultural perspective and an ethnicity perspective, there is a great difference in the way people within the Jewish community would perceive security as a whole. For instance, if I had an Israeli who then immigrated to the United States, their worldview on security and how the synagogue or how the Jewish community should be protected is going to be much different than a secular Jewish person, let's say in the Boca area or on Long Island. Much different outlook. Or for even that matter, if you take somebody, I have a good friend from Uzbekistan who is Jewish, you look at what they lived under and then came here to the United States, their worldview is going to be completely different. And those also, the Jews who have immigrated from Europe recently, they've seen the uptick in attacks in Europe with the Jewish community. So law enforcement needs to know that. They also need to know the dynamics of the same dynamics that if they go to their church, for instance, right. What is the church? Well, what is the synagogue? You know, it's very, very basic information, because you know why? The bad guy knows this. The bad guy who's going to commit an attack realizes this. And I say this to the Jewish community too. Culturally speaking, not religiously speaking, when I make this statement, the bad guy knows just as much about your Jewish culture as you do, if not more. So they have to know. Why? They know all the holidays, right? They know where the synagogue is. They know that's a house of worship. They might even dwell on this over and over and do their own research into the Torah or what have you.
Is this because they live in the community?
Yes,
or
exactly.
So typically, so just like car accidents typically happen within 5 miles of your home, are you suggesting that the criminal lives within 5 miles of the house of worship?
Let's look at Ellie, that is a perfect point, because this is one of the most important things about Jewish security you just hit upon that I explain all the time.
Okay.
Don't listen to the noise in the media. Don't listen to the noise in the media. Oh, this is what's happening now in the Middle East or whatever. Your attacker is going to be foreign. No. If we look at the attacks in the United States, what do we see in the recent kinetic attacks? Tree of Life, Poway. I mean, the list can go on and on. People are from the community. They know the community. This is why it's so dangerous. that individual might have grown up in the community. They might have been invited as a guest to a bar bat mitzvah, to a social event at the synagogue. They might, maybe they never did, but maybe on their way to work, they know the roads to and from that synagogue. They know the main highways to and from that synagogue. They know the high holidays when the synagogues are going to be full. They are living right there. So they understand the heartbeat and the rhythm of the community, not just the Jewish community, but so ingress and egress routes. They might have friends who grew up. So this is very, very, very important for the security. That's why law enforcement is very challenged by this, because they are always, when a volatile incident happens at a synagogue, they are coming basically from the right of bang. We always want to stay left of bang. Right. They're coming. That's the book, by the way. But we always want to be left of the incident, not in the incident, and definitely not right. But law enforcement always finds themselves on the coming to the rescue and being basically reactive rather than proactive during these volatile incidents. So that's why the Jewish community, when I walk through these synagogues, and there's no, it's very hard. I understand being a nonprofit and asking for donations and what have you, but there's really very little sustainable security budgets for these synagogues.
Well, why don't we have the DHS that has now provided all of these grants? I mean, these synagogues should be flush with cash and have top-notch security.
No. Those grants are not sustainable budgets. That is not sustainable security. In my opinion, those grants are used for two things. And I was an evaluator for those grants, and I also had to grade those grants. So I have a lot of knowledge about the grants. Here's the thing. The grants are one tool on the tool belt. They, in my opinion, are good for two things. One, as seed money to start a project, okay? Right. Or two, monies to complement an already existing project. But here's the problem. Here is the big problem with those grants. And there's too much within the Jewish community relying on these grants. They are good, but you have to be very specific with them. Okay. They're not sustainable. In other words, the synagogue or the Jewish institution needs a sustainable budget above and beyond the grant, because security is something that's very fluid and also has to be upgraded. If you don't have a sustainable budget, you're never going to really have a secure physical security protocol and footprint that is really aggressive in detection, to detect, deter, deny, and delay the adversary. If you're only relying on a grant, that is no way close to sustainability. And there's another aspect to this too, Ellie, that's very, very important with that has to deal with this, that I saw when I was working in counterterrorism. I had to go out to these synagogues. I call it RASA, RASA. And I explained this to the synagogues a lot, and I did it all the time. Is the security robust? Okay. Is it appropriate? Is it sustainable? And is it adaptable? This is very, very, very important. And in order to have that protocol and that future footprint for a security posture to challenge the adversary, that is what's needed. And law enforcement can assist. Right. Law enforcement has the personnel to assist, and not just for the Jewish community, to the churches or whoever, any house of worship. They have that expertise a lot of times on their staff who can help.
Now, why aren't the synagogues, or are they, working closely with the Catholic Church, the Orthodox synagogues working with the Catholic Church, and so on? Because I would imagine that the church has a much larger budget than the synagogues do. And they must be able to say, this is what we're doing. Why don't you guys do that too?
It's funny you mentioned that. So I had a very large church I had to deal with, and one of the people there who was in charge of their operations and security told me, and he said it like this: the churches, as he said, and I'm going back a few years ago, said that they don't talk amongst each other about the grants. The Jewish community, though, talked about these grants and about the security and what have you. And he said that was one of the things, the communication. And I'm not just talking when I meant communication, not just under, the Orthodox, just within the Orthodox community, Reform community, and, conservative. He was mentioning the entire community talks.
Right.
And that was one of the things why the community goes back to, which I mentioned before, we went to break, is liaisoning. Liaisoning, I always pushed, and I was kind of like liaisoning in my last position in counterterrorism. I was always tapped on the shoulder, hey, go out. That is very important, extremely important. The more liaisoning that goes on to have these law enforcement professionals come physically to the synagogue or the Jewish institution, it serves several purposes. Right. One, line of communication. You don't want to be in the event, who should I call? Or this is what's happening. Should I be concerned, or I need some information?
Sure.
So you want that line of communication already established. Two, from a practical perspective, a walkthrough of the facility. If something goes bad, what am I dealing with? Law enforcement does not mind coming and doing the walkthroughs. And you might even be accompanied by even other first responders. They get to know everybody. They get to know the fire department, law enforcement, because you don't know what type of incident will happen. So they might come all together.
Right.
And then three, when you have this open dialogue, you're developing an interpersonal relationship. I can go, hey, Ellie, how you doing today? Hey, Mark, you hear anything? What do you have that you can openly discuss? Nothing confidential, sure. Nothing. But what do you have? Hey, I heard about this. Are you familiar with this? Or we're going to bring all these synagogues together. We're going to talk about this topic in physical security, or talk about what's trending up that we should be aware of that might actually hit our community. This is good policing. This goes back to community policing. And I always stress that does this have to happen every week? No. Every month, if they can, if both parties can do it. But it should happen at least 4 times a year. It should at least happen 4 times a year, once a quarter.
So, we have about 10, 12 minutes left. And you're retired law enforcement. So let's take this down to the gutter a little bit. Since you're no longer on the clock. And you're no longer going to be called in front of internal affairs. We take a look at on one hand, I can tell you that, the Baltimore community just received $1 million grant as a whole. This goes along the lines of what you were talking about, where the Orthodox community talks to one another. And when I use the Jewish community as an example, I'm referring to the Orthodox community because I have a little bit of knowledge because I am an Orthodox Jewish guy. But so I can speak a little bit, although I'm not as involved in these aspects within the community. But on the other hand, we just recently saw a tweet from the Biden administration's liaison to the Jewish community that says, if you're kind of concerned about your safety, maybe you should take off something along the lines of maybe you should take off your kippah and put away your Star of David. When had we ever thought that we would actually hear such a thing coming from an American presidential administration? You fast forward or move down, go 1.9 miles down Pennsylvania Avenue, and you go to Congress where you have Representative Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib saying things that they've been and making suggestions and innuendo that is anti-Semitic by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not comparing it to anti-Semitic remarks to racist remarks by somebody, that's irrelevant to this conversation that we're talking about right now. And then you have people like Mayor de Blasio, who by all accounts has somewhat of a double standard. I'll let the viewer define what somewhat means, or double standard means, but has somewhat of a double standard when dealing with COVID-related matters between the Orthodox, or in particular the Hasidic community in New York, versus other communities, or versus a Hasidic rabbi has a wedding that has several thousand people there. They get shut down and vilified in the media, but yet you have BLM and other protests, and everybody is okay with that. And then, of course, you have Governor Cuomo in New York, and I'm in particular using New York as examples because you're from New York, NYPD, and we're trying to keep it as to your field of, or scope of knowledge, rather than and where he is now bringing he had press conferences regarding his daily press conference regarding COVID, and uses video clips and footage of Hasidic events that happened years before COVID. How does politics and the agenda of politicians get in the way of law enforcement? I mean, this is something that has a great impact. Now, for me personally, I have the luxury of watching what everybody at the Institute does, and I learn from it. Personally, I'm involved in foreign policy and working with foreign governments and so on, and I really see the impact that rhetoric such as this has overseas. I can only imagine what it has domestically. Tell me, what does this do to Detective Investigator Marc Black from NYPD when doing your job and trying to prevent, or forget about prevent, trying to respond to anti-Semitic attacks in New York? Or, by the way, I just want to add to any community, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's any church, whether it is attacks on atheists' houses of meetings, or whatever they have. It doesn't. What does that do to you?
Oh, it ties up our hands completely. And I revert back to this, Ellie. What's the proximate cause of this? What's the proximate cause of these politicians who want to set up policies that will tie the hands of law enforcement? The proximate cause and the responsibility and accountability of this goes right back to the voter. The voter put these individuals in power on their behalf through the vote, and that gave them the green light to set up these policies. As an investigator, and anybody in law enforcement pretty much knows what I'm about to say here, is all police departments are bureaucratic organizations. And yes, they tend to be political because there's a mayor's office or there's a county executive office. So there are some political bureaucratic hoops a lot of times that the law enforcement professional will have to jump through, and that's in the management realm. But that all trickles down to the average patrol person, to the average detective investigator doing their jobs day in and day out. What happens is, as I stated before, when politics gets involved in policing, and it has a negative, I repeat, policies become negative, then you don't have efficient and effective policing. And this affects everybody within the community. I think now what you're seeing is with respect to the Jewish community, because I am in contact with the Jewish community, is that they were supporting, let's say, in the beginning, or even, BLM or some other groups. But now what they're starting to see is that now some of these attacks from extreme left wing, never mind the right, extreme right, are happening because of the people that were voted in and supported to defund the police movement. Their safety and security for their Jewish institutions are now becoming jeopardized. And the reason for this is, even though a lot of these left wing wanted to defund monetarily through budgets, what really happened was you have manpower issues where a lot of people have left their departments. And when you don't have manpower on your department, the supervisor then has to make a decision, and upper management of these police departments, how are we going to allocate manpower and where? And this is directly affecting the Jewish community. And let me give you an example, because I was on the phone with somebody recently about this. A synagogue might have 2 or 3 patrol people in front of their synagogue. Well, maybe now they're only going to have 1. What's going to happen at the high holidays when you might have, in some of these huge synagogues, have 500 or more people? Or what about that small synagogue where maybe only 100 to 200 people show up? With that patrolman who sat in front of the synagogue during the day was there. But now there's still radio runs that have to be answered. So what is that supervisor or upper management going to do? Maybe now it's only a directed patrol, which means you just pop in for 5 minutes, look around, and then leave. So it's no more a fixed post. So voting has consequences. And now how do we proceed forward, particularly within the Jewish community? I think this is a serious question within the Jewish community on how we want our law enforcement, not only to protect the Jewish community, but to protect our society as well. What type of law enforcement are we looking for? Can there be reform? Sure, there could always be reform, but let's have common sense reform. Can there be reform in the judicial system as well? Let's have common sense reform. But let's make sure when there is reform, it becomes more efficient and more effective, so that individual who's in law enforcement can do their job properly with high morale. Because once an individual with a lot of experience leaves, that experience can never be recaptured. Granted, everybody's replaceable. But when you start to lose experience with mentors who are leaving their insight and their knowledge of the vocation, because policing is a vocation, that next generation should be prepared to take the torch and run law enforcement efficiently and effectively. We're not going to see that. And unfortunately, Ellie, this is the problem. Looking down the line with policy, the main challenge of law enforcement going forward is the loss of all this experience. This will have an effect on crime. This will have an effect on how prosecutors prosecute cases, on how that case comes to them. This will have an effect on manpower issues. And this is something that no matter how much money you throw at it, it can't be resolved. Money here is not the issue for the police. It's retaining qualified individuals who have heard that this is a calling, it's a vocation they want to learn, and that they're learning not only through the academics, through their academy, but also learning the vocation from seasoned veterans. And one other thing here I want to speak about, the mentoring. When that individual leaves, okay, mentoring is just not for the rookie. Mentoring, you could have 15, 20 years on. When I was helping the Jewish community, I already had 15 years on, but I needed mentors to show me the way so I can be more of an asset to the community as a whole. That's not happening. We're seeing this.
Now, do we see that mentoring is not happening because, in particular, because of budgetary issues, or do we see mentoring not happening because that's been fading away anyway?
What we see with the mentoring, and I can only talk from an NYPD perspective,
Correct.
And from what observations are, when you have not hundreds, thousands leaving a department, the talent goes out the door. So it's not a money issue, all right? It's not a money. I just had a great conversation with an individual who left the department. He wanted to stay the full 20 years, but was like, I'm not going to stay. I'm leaving. Why? Why would you risk everything because of poor policy? And this is what I tried to convey to the Jewish community as a whole. And this is directly related to how law enforcement is going to combat anti-Semitism. There has to be an understanding that policy directly affects the individual investigator and individual patrol person. If they have low morale, if they feel that they have no more tools to protect them from doing their job, from making an arrest on probable cause, as an example, which I'm saying, which I, in a roundabout way, just said they got rid of qualified immunity.
Right.
If they don't have the support from the community, why stay? Why risk their mortgage? They're people too. Law enforcement are people too. They understand the risk of law enforcement, but they also have families.
Sure.
And that's something that I always said to the community. Remember, when you call 911, there's no questions asked. People in blue, law enforcement, are going to come to assist. But if you keep electing officials who are going to compromise or frustrate the law enforcement professional, don't expect effective and efficient law enforcement anymore.
Right. Don't
expect that.
So this has been an eye-opening conversation, and we're going to have many more of these conversations in the future. But I appreciate your time with us today, Marc Black, Senior Fellow at the Gold Institute. You know, as we talk about, as we continue to focus on anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of hate crimes across the board, we're gonna continue to have these conversations. Again, practical discussions about from law enforcement. Maybe our next call or our next conversation, we will have a broader scope and bring on some of our colleagues, our other law enforcement colleagues at the Gold Institute. If you wish to support the project on focusing on proactive combating of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic attacks on houses of worship and proactive attacks on houses of worship in general, please visit the Gold Institute's website at goldiis.org. Again, thank you, Marc, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Ali.